when Solomon Carter, a respected civil rights leader, enters a small-town courthouse. He's met with immediate prejudice and hostility from those who fail to see beyond his appearance. Assumptions and racial biases turn a simple visit into a humiliating ordeal, exposing the deep-seated racism embedded in the system. Solomon's calm demeanor contrasts sharply with the blatant mistreatment he faces, as officers and officials escalate the situation based on their unfounded judgments. The story highlights the infuriating reality of racial profiling and systemic injustice, forcing viewers to confront uncomfortable truths about racism in America and its lingering impact. The summer heat clung to the small southern town of Eldersville like a wet sheet, thick and unrelenting. The cracked sidewalks hummed under the weight of the afternoon sun, while cicadas buzzed relentlessly from the shade of tired oak trees. The town moved slow this time of day, the kind of slow reserved for places where change felt like a myth. Dr. Alexander Reese, a man who didn't belong to this rhythm but carried himself as if he did, parked his vintage Cadillac outside an aging cafe. The car, though classic and understated, gleamed, much like its owner. Alexander stepped out, tall and deliberate, dressed in clean slacks and a pressed linen shirt. A subtle, polished watch peeked from his wrist, a testament to his quiet success. His face, lined in all the right places, bore the kind of confidence that neither wealth nor power could counterfeit. Locals seated outside the cafe turned to look. Not because he was unfamiliar. Alexander had visited Eldersville twice before, but because people in these parts rarely saw a black man, especially one so composed and well-kept, without their hackles rising or suspicion stirring. Inside, the cafe was dimmer, a refuge from the unforgiving sun. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with weary eyes and an apron smudged with flour, glanced up and hesitated. Alexander noticed the pause before she forced a polite smile. "Afternoon. Sit anywhere you'd like." "Thank you," Alexander replied, his voice low and smooth, touched by an eloquence that hinted at more than his modest demeanor let on. He chose a corner booth, close to the window, where sunlight carved sharp lines across the polished table. As he settled, Alexander removed a well-worn book from his leather bag. Reading in public was a habit he'd kept since his days as a medical student, both a way to pass the time and to disarm strangers. A black man alone in a room often made people uncomfortable. A black man reading seemed to quiet their fears, though not always. As he turned the page, the door swung open, and 3 men stepped inside, their heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. Alexander didn't look up immediately, but he felt them, felt their eyes. The scrape of chairs being pulled out seemed louder than necessary. The men sat nearby, their voices rising in pointed whispers that traveled through the near-empty room. "Never seen him before. Think he's lost?" one muttered just loud enough. His words bounced off the quiet like a hammer against glass. "Or maybe he's just comfortable, sitting here like he owns the place," another chimed in, a sneer evident in his tone. Alexander didn't flinch. Years of navigating these situations had taught him a rule he'd carried all his life: never let them see you rattle. He simply turned the page, absorbing the words of his book while keeping the men in the periphery of his gaze. The waitress reappeared, this time with a thin pad and pencil. "Ready to order?" she asked, her tone a little strained. She glanced at the men before focusing back on Alexander. "Just a coffee, please. Black." He smiled warmly, as if the tension in the room didn't exist. She nodded quickly and turned away, though not before casting another wary glance toward the men. The tallest of the 3 leaned back in his chair, chewing lazily on a toothpick, his eyes locked on Alexander. "Don't suppose you're from around here." Alexander finally looked up, calm and composed. "I'm not." The man smirked. "Figures. You people don't usually come through Eldersville. What brings you here?" Alexander held the man's gaze a moment longer than necessary. He recognized the challenge, the bait dangling for him to bite. Instead, he smiled faintly. "Business. What kind of business?" The question was edged with suspicion, a clear test to see how far they could push. Alexander returned his focus to the book. "I'm a doctor." The smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion. A doctor. In Eldersville. What for? I was invited, Alexander said simply, his voice measured, to meet with a client. Before the man could respond, the waitress returned, setting Alexander's coffee down with a nervous hand. Anything else? She asked quickly. That'll be all. Thank you, Alexander replied gently. He took a sip, letting the bitterness wash over him, and returned his attention to the book. The men stared at him for another beat before one muttered under his breath, "Ain't no doctor I know dresses like that." The early afternoon sun blazed over the sleepy streets of Briar Ridge, a town caught somewhere between yesterday and never quite today. Time moved differently here, slow, reluctant, like it had its heels dug into the dirt. Sidewalks cracked under the weight of decades-old roots, faded shop signs hung askew, and the lone stoplight blinked red, yellow, green over intersections that rarely saw more than 2 cars. It wasn't a town people passed through for fun. It wasn't a town people like Judge Elijah Monroe ever needed to step into. And yet there he was. Elijah pulled his polished Buick into a parking space beside an old diner. The car didn't scream wealth. It didn't have to. Its pristine chrome trim and quiet hum spoke volumes to those who knew the language of understated elegance. Elijah Monroe was a man of habit, careful, deliberate habits. He didn't flaunt, didn't boast, but he didn't hide either. You could be powerful without putting your foot on anyone's neck. He stepped out of the car and straightened the cuffs of his soft blue Oxford shirt. Tailored slacks, well-polished shoes, and a leather bag in hand, Elijah looked every bit the picture of grace and composure. A man in his early 50s, he carried himself with an ease that came from years of fighting battles no one ever saw. Inside, the diner buzzed with a low hum of conversation and clattering dishes. It was the kind of place where booze were worn smooth from generations of elbows leaning in close over coffee and gossip. The menu hadn't changed in decades, nor had the clientele. Mostly locals who had lived their entire lives in Briar Ridge and planned to die there too. When Elijah walked in, heads turned. Not all at once, not openly. Just long enough for him to notice. He was used to it. He didn't belong here, they thought. Men like him, black men who looked this polished, this purposeful, always seemed to raise silent questions in towns like this. The waitress, a thin woman with tired eyes and frizzy hair tied in a loose bun, glanced up. Her gaze lingered on Elijah just a beat longer than it did anyone else. "Sit anywhere you'd like," she said, voice polite but distant. Elijah chose a small table near the window. He set down his bag, placed his phone face down beside it, and folded his hands as he waited. From the corner of his eye, he saw them, 2 men at the counter. One wore a baseball cap pulled low, his plaid shirt untucked over faded jeans. The other, older, sported a hard, weathered face and a belt buckle the size of a small plate. They were watching him, casually, lazily, but watching nonetheless. He could feel it. The younger one said something under his breath, and the older man snorted, shaking his head. Elijah ignored it. He had long mastered the art of silence, of deciding which battles were worth the fight and which could be left on the table. This wasn't the time. Not yet. The waitress returned, pen hovering above her pad. "Coffee," she offered. "Yes, thank you." "Black." She scribbled it down. "Anything to eat?" Elijah glanced at the menu, though he already knew what he'd order. Scrambled eggs and toast. The waitress hesitated, just barely, then nodded and disappeared toward the kitchen. Elijah leaned back in his chair, gazing out the window as the town passed by in slow motion. A boy pedaled his bike down the cracked pavement, a dog trotting alongside him. An elderly couple shuffled past the hardware store, hand in hand, their shadows stretching long in the sunlight. There was something painfully familiar about towns like this. Elijah had seen them all his life. First as a boy who never felt welcome, then as a man whose name carried weight in rooms where decisions were made. Now, as a judge presiding over some of the most complex civil rights cases in the state, Elijah Monroe had made it his life's work to understand the systems that towns like Briar Ridge clung to so desperately. Today was no exception. The reason for his visit was neatly typed on the papers inside his bag: an old family estate tangled in legal disputes. Someone had called him a distant cousin, a name half forgotten in the fog of family stories. They needed help untangling it, and Elijah, despite everything, couldn't say no. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Elijah turned just as the two men from the counter slid into the booth across from him, uninvited. The younger one, in the baseball cap, flashed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon," he drawled. Elijah inclined his head, polite but silent. The older man let out a small, humorless chuckle. "Well, look at you," he said, voice gravelly. "Ain't seen you around here before." "Passing through," Elijah replied, his tone smooth as glass. "You don't say," the man replied, as if Elijah's very existence was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "Business or pleasure?" Elijah kept his posture relaxed. "Family. Family." The younger one leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "Didn't think anyone like you had family around here." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Anyone like me?" There was the opening. He knew it when he heard it. The men were testing him, poking around the edges to see how he might flinch. The older man shrugged, a feigned nonchalance masking something far less innocent. "You know what I mean." "I don't think I do," Elijah replied evenly, holding the man's gaze. The younger one's grin faded just slightly. Elijah watched the smugness waver. He'd seen it before. This look, this quiet hostility born from discomfort. Some men didn't know what to do with someone like him. Someone who didn't fit their expectations or their neat little boxes. Before either could say anything else, the waitress returned, balancing Elijah's coffee and plate of eggs. She glanced at the two men and lingered uncomfortably as she set his food down. "Anything else?" she asked him softly. Elijah smiled up at her. "This is perfect. Thank you." The waitress hesitated before retreating. The younger man snorted, shaking his head. "You sure look comfortable," he muttered, his voice just loud enough for Elijah to hear. Elijah calmly picked up his fork, cutting into the eggs. "Why wouldn't I be?" The older man shifted in his seat, eyes narrowing. "Folks around here don't see people like you sitting pretty in places like this. Makes him wonder." Elijah chewed thoughtfully, letting the silence stretch. Then he set his fork down and folded his hands. Maybe that's the problem. For a moment, neither man said anything. The younger one's smugness faltered completely, replaced by something closer to confusion. Elijah didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to lean in or glower. Calm, deliberate words always cut deeper. The older man studied him, suspicion still clouding his features. "What kind of work did you say you do?" "I didn't," Elijah replied, sipping his coffee. The older man opened his mouth to press further. But before he could, the faint sound of a bell echoed from across the diner. Elijah glanced up and saw a figure step inside. A woman in her early 30s, dressed sharply in business casual. She scanned the room until her eyes landed on him. "Judge Monroe?" she called, her voice bright and clear. The two men froze. Elijah stood smoothly, wiping his hands with a napkin before extending one to the woman. "Miss Campbell, thank you for meeting me." She smiled warmly. "It's a pleasure, sir." As they exchanged pleasantries, Elijah allowed himself a glance back at the booth. The two men stared at him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and unease. Whatever assumptions they'd made about him were cracking under the weight of something they couldn't reconcile. Elijah turned back to Miss Campbell and gestured toward the door. "Shall we?" As they left, the men remained silent. Elijah didn't look back. He didn't need to. Outside, the sun had begun to dip lower, bathing Briar Ridge in long shadows. The world felt quieter, as though something had shifted, however subtly. Elijah Monroe walked toward his Buick, his pace unhurried, his mind already focused on the work ahead. This was just the beginning. Elijah Monroe walked down Main Street alongside Miss Campbell, the warm sun dipping lower as it cast their long shadows against the uneven pavement. The lawyer, young, sharp, and eager, matched his pace, a manila folder tucked beneath her arm. "So, the property dispute?" Elijah asked, his tone casual, though his mind was already working 2 steps ahead. "Yes, sir," she replied. "It's a tricky one. The Thompsons are fighting to claim it based on a 1950s deed, but there's some ambiguity in the records. The land has been in your family since emancipation, so you'd think it'd be cut and dry, but nothing's ever cut and dry," Elijah finished softly, his words tinged with experience. They approached the courthouse at the end of the block. It was a squat brick building, dated but imposing, with white columns and a grandiose double-door entrance. Above the doors, a plaque read, "Briar Ridge Municipal Court, Justice for All." The word struck Elijah, though he'd long stopped looking for irony in such places. "Ready?" Miss Campbell asked, adjusting her bag nervously. Elijah smiled faintly, calming her with a nod. "Always." The inside of the courthouse was predictably sparse. Worn tile floors, dull white walls, and flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. Elijah stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the ground. But no sooner had they entered than an older guard stationed by the metal detector stood to attention. "Hold it there," the guard barked, pointing a stern finger at Elijah. Elijah paused mid-step, glancing between the man and the empty security line. "Is there an issue?" The guard's gaze swept over him, head to toe, before landing on his leather bag. "What's in there?" Elijah tightened his jaw, though his voice remained even. "Just papers." "Bag on the table," the guard ordered, not so much as glancing at Miss Campbell as she stepped forward unimpeded. Elijah exhaled quietly, stepping toward the table. Miss Campbell turned, frowning as she realized he was being singled out. "Excuse me," she started, her voice edged with polite disbelief. "It's fine," Elijah said softly, cutting her off before she could argue. "Let's not make a scene." The guard rifled through Elijah's bag with unnecessary vigor, flipping open folders and shaking the leather as if he expected something to fall out. His expression remained hard, as if daring Elijah to react. Finally, satisfied, or perhaps disappointed, he tossed the bag back onto the table. "You're clear," the guard grunted, waving him through with the kind of casual disrespect reserved for someone unworthy of regard. Elijah met the guard's gaze, steady, level, but said nothing as he picked up his bag and strode through the detector. Miss Campbell whispered an apology under her breath, but Elijah dismissed it with a small shake of his head. This wasn't her fault. It wasn't the first time, but it still stung. Inside the courtroom, the Thompsons were already seated at one of the long wooden tables, a smugness to their posture that Elijah recognized immediately. He'd seen their type before, landowners clinging to outdated ideals, convinced of their entitlement. Mr. Henry Thompson, an older man in his late 60s with silver hair and a perpetually ruddy face, looked up as Elijah entered. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Well, Thompson muttered, just loud enough for Elijah to hear. "Didn't expect you to send a representative. Thought you'd be too high and mighty to come down to our little town." Elijah ignored the bait, settling his bag on the table opposite the Thompsons. Miss Campbell bristled, but said nothing, knowing this wasn't her moment to intervene. Elijah smoothed his tie and turned to face the judge entering the room, an older man in a gray robe, Judge Alton Hughes. Elijah had researched Hughes before coming. Appointed decades ago, the man had built a reputation for tradition, a word that often carried more weight than fairness. Still, Elijah believed in facing men like him head-on. He had no choice. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the room shuffled to its feet. Judge Hughes looked up from his bench, his expression flickering with surprise as his eyes landed on Elijah. For a split second, the mask slipped, and Elijah saw it. The familiar look of quiet judgment. It didn't matter who Elijah Monroe was. It didn't matter that he sat on a federal bench. Here, in this room, he was just another outsider, another black man in a place where the weight of history pressed down like a vice. "You may be seated," Hughes said, voice gravelly. The proceedings began quickly. Miss Campbell opened the argument with a clear, concise presentation of the documents, the lineage of ownership tracing back generations. Elijah let her speak, proud of the confidence in her voice, but as he watched Judge Hughes, he noticed the way the older man thumbed through the pages absent-mindedly, uninterested. Across the room, Henry Thompson and his lawyer, a balding man in a brown suit, glanced at one another with muted grins. They were comfortable here, Elijah thought. Too comfortable. This was their house, and they assumed they had already won. Judge Hughes, Miss Campbell said firmly, breaking through Elijah's thoughts. The evidence clearly supports Mr. Monroe's ownership of the land. We request that you dismiss the Thompsons' claim entirely. Hughes looked up lazily, glancing between Miss Campbell and Elijah before fixing his gaze on Henry Thompson. Mr. Thompson, he said almost congenially, do you have anything to add before I consider counsel's request? Thompson stood with the casual air of someone who'd been handed opportunities his entire life. Your Honor, he drawled, clasping his hands in front of him. With all due respect to Mr. Monroe, he said Elijah's name with a practiced sneer. This land's been in question for years. My family has maintained it, paid taxes on it. As far as we're concerned, the land belongs to us. It'd be a shame if someone just took it away on a technicality. The words dripped with condescension, and the implication was clear. Elijah's family, black sharecroppers who had been gifted the land after emancipation, couldn't possibly have a rightful claim. Thompson's version of history refused to see it as theirs to begin with. Elijah's pulse thrummed, but his face remained neutral. Stay calm, he reminded himself. Anger would serve no one here but Thompson. Miss Campbell rose again, flipping through a stack of documents. Your Honor, we've already established that. Judge Hughes held up a hand, silencing her. I think we've heard enough. His tone suggested otherwise. He glanced at Thompson, then Elijah. I'll need a moment to review the evidence. Elijah's jaw tightened. Review the evidence. The evidence was clear. This wasn't complicated. Hughes stood abruptly and retreated into his chambers, leaving the room in uneasy silence. Henry Thompson turned in his chair, looking over his shoulder at Elijah. Don't take it personally, he said with a smirk. It's just business. Elijah finally spoke, his voice smooth as velvet. Justice isn't business, Mr. Thompson. It's a principle. Perhaps you've forgotten that. Thompson's smile faltered, and his face flushed. Before he could reply, Judge Hughes returned, his robe rustling as he stepped back to the bench. I've reviewed the evidence, Hughes began, though Elijah suspected he hadn't so much as glanced at the documents. And given the long-standing maintenance by the Thompsons, I'm inclined to order further investigation before making a final decision. Miss Campbell stood, her voice sharp. Your Honor, with all due respect, there's no need for further investigation. The records are clear. Judge Hughes leveled her with a look that silenced her instantly. Further investigation is necessary, he repeated, his tone icy. Court adjourned. The gavel struck, sharp and final. Elijah rose slowly, every movement measured. Around him, the Thompsons shook hands, their confidence barely contained. Hughes had given them time, a chance to manipulate, muddy, and delay. Elijah had seen this tactic before. Miss Campbell turned to him, whispering urgently. We'll appeal. We'll. Not here, Elijah said quietly, his voice calm. Let's go. They gathered their things, and as Elijah turned toward the exit, his gaze met Judge Hughes's one last time. Hughes held the look a moment longer than necessary, something unreadable in his expression. A challenge, perhaps, or a warning. Elijah didn't flinch. Outside the courthouse, the sun had disappeared, replaced by the cooling shadows of evening. Miss Campbell walked beside him, her frustration simmering. I can't believe this, she muttered. It was obvious. It always is, Elijah replied softly. He glanced across the street where Henry Thompson leaned against his truck, watching them go. Elijah knew what the man was thinking, what they were all thinking. Men like Elijah Monroe weren't supposed to win here. Not in Briar Ridge, not in their house. But as he stepped into the quiet evening, Elijah made a silent promise. This fight isn't over. The days following the courthouse debacle in Briar Ridge were a storm brewing under the surface. Elijah Monroe knew the Thompsons were playing for time, but what they really wanted was opportunity, to shift the narrative, to erase a history they refused to acknowledge. For Elijah, this wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was personal. The town, too, had begun to whisper. Briar Ridge was a place where news spread like wildfire, especially when it centered around a black man challenging a white family's claim. Entitlement and troublemaker were words he overheard in the corners of diners and hardware stores. Eyes followed him when he passed, some curious, others accusing, a few sympathetic but silent. Through it all, Elijah maintained his poise. It was late afternoon when the phone call came. Elijah was in his office, leaning over a stack of deeds and old court records, trying to find anything that would strengthen his case. The phone buzzed loudly, jarring him from his thoughts. He picked it up. "Mr. Monroe." Miss Campbell's voice rang out, panicked. "You need to get down to the property. Now." Elijah's heart tightened. "What happened?" "It's the Thompsons. They're out there with trucks, tearing down the barn. They're saying they own it now. It's like they're claiming squatters' rights before the case is settled." The line crackled with static, but Elijah could hear shouting in the background. "I'm on my way." By the time Elijah arrived at the family property, his tires kicking up clouds of dust as he pulled onto the narrow road, the scene ahead filled him with dread. A large yellow backhoe sat at the center of the field, its bucket raised and splattered with debris. Where his family's barn once stood, a simple wooden structure his great-grandfather had built with his own hands, there was now a jagged pile of splintered wood, broken beams, and shattered history. Henry Thompson stood nearby, arms crossed, overseeing the destruction like a lord inspecting his land. He wasn't alone. His lawyer and a handful of others from town, men Elijah recognized as Thompson's good OL boys, hovered close, smug and complicit. Miss Campbell stood off to the side, furious, her phone in hand. She must have called the authorities. Elijah stepped out of his car, his presence drawing immediate attention. Thompson turned, his mouth curving into a slow, satisfied smirk. "Mr. Monroe," Thompson called, spreading his arms in mock greeting. "Fancy seeing you here." Elijah ignored the taunt and approached, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage. "You have no right to do this," Elijah said evenly, though his voice trembled with restrained anger. "The property dispute hasn't been settled yet." "Oh, it's settled," Thompson replied, his tone dripping condescension. "Judge Hughes didn't say we couldn't move forward, now did he? And as far as I'm concerned, this land's ours." "Not according to the law." Thompson stepped closer, his smile hardening. "This isn't about the law, boy. It's about knowing when to quit." The word hit Elijah like a slap, boy. It was deliberate, a relic of the past hurled forward to remind him of his place. Miss Campbell took a step toward them, her voice tight. "Mr. Thompson, you're violating the court's stay on this matter. I've already called the sheriff." "Call whoever you like," Thompson interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "We'll see what the sheriff thinks when he gets here." As if on cue, the unmistakable crunch of tires approached. A white sheriff's cruiser pulled onto the property, dust curling in its wake. Sheriff Eric Dalton stepped out, a tall, barrel-chested man with a reputation for fairness, but also for knowing when to look the other way. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Dalton said, hitching up his belt as he walked toward the group. He glanced at Thompson, then at Elijah. "Someone want to tell me what's going on here?" Elijah spoke first. "Sheriff, the Thompsons are demolishing the barn without cause. This property is under dispute, and they have no legal authority to be here." "Is that so?" Dalton said, turning toward Thompson. "Sure is," Thompson replied, shrugging. "The court didn't say we couldn't make use of our land. We're just clearing things up, doing some maintenance." "Maintenance?" Elijah's voice rose. "You've destroyed a historical structure. My family structure. This isn't maintenance, it's vandalism." Sheriff Dalton scratched at his chin, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, technically speaking, Mr. Monroe, there's no formal injunction against the Thompsons right now." Elijah felt a flare of frustration. "That doesn't make what they're doing right, Sheriff. You know this is out of line." "Maybe," Dalton replied, eyeing the wreckage with a hint of guilt, "but I can't stop what's already done. So, you're just going to let this happen?" "I'll file a report," Dalton said, as if that settled it. "You'll have to take it up with the judge." Henry Thompson let out a laugh, low, satisfied, ugly. "Sounds like you're out of luck, Monroe." Elijah turned sharply toward Thompson, the anger finally bubbling to the surface. "You think this is over?" he said, his voice a controlled storm. "You think destroying that barn erases what this land means? What my family built here?" Thompson's smirk faltered, but he covered it quickly. "Doesn't matter what it means. It's ours now." Elijah stared at him, the weight of 100 years of history pressing against his chest. Men like Thompson didn't care about legacy. They didn't care about justice or fairness. They cared about control, and they always played dirty. That night, Elijah sat in his office, the weight of the day sinking into his bones. Miss Campbell sat across from him, furious. "They can't get away with this," she snapped. "That barn was everything to your family." Elijah looked down at his hands, steadying himself. "They're trying to bait me," he said finally. "They want me to lose control, to play into their hands." Miss Campbell frowned. "So, what do we do?" Elijah's jaw tightened as he reached for a file and opened it. Inside were copies of old deeds, tax records, and something else, a photo. It was black and white, faded, but it showed his great-grandfather, standing in front of the barn with a hammer in his hand and a baby on his hip. His ancestor had built that barn with nothing but grit and sweat, defying odds and carving out a piece of dignity in a world that gave him none. Elijah held the photo for a long moment before looking up. "We don't let them win." Miss Campbell sat up straighter. "How?" "We go back to court," Elijah said firmly. "And this time, we don't just argue ownership. We argue intent. The Thompsons have crossed a line, and I'll make sure everyone in Briar Ridge knows it." Miss Campbell hesitated. "Judge Hughes won't make it easy." "He's corrupt," Elijah finished. "I know." He glanced at the window, where the moon glimmered faintly against the darkness. "But this is bigger than him now." He looked at Miss Campbell, his eyes alight with purpose. "Call the press. Call our allies. Call anyone who'll listen. If they want to fight, they're going to get one." Miss Campbell's expression shifted into a determined smile. "Yes, sir." The next morning, Elijah stood at the courthouse steps as a crowd gathered, a mix of reporters, community leaders, and concerned townsfolk. The Thompsons had the money, the connections, and the favoritism of the system. But Elijah had something else: the truth. As he adjusted his tie and prepared to step forward, the courthouse doors opened, and Judge Hughes emerged. His face was hard, unreadable, but his eyes locked onto Elijah with a warning. This wasn't going to be easy. But Elijah Monroe had faced storms before, and he was ready. Elijah Monroe stood in the courthouse hallway, his jaw tight as murmurs rippled through the crowd gathering outside the chamber doors. Inside Judge Hughes' courtroom, the stakes had just been raised, and Elijah felt the weight of it pressing against his ribs. Henry Thompson had arrived that morning, smug and flanked by his attorney, who had filed an emergency motion to dismiss Elijah's claim altogether. It was a calculated move, one designed to ambush Elijah, knock him off balance, and crush his fight before it could gain momentum. The courtroom was a powder keg of tension. Elijah sat at the plaintiff's table, his files neatly stacked, his pen steady in his hand. Across the aisle, Thompson lounged back in his chair like a man watching the world bend to his will. The corners of his mouth curled as though he knew something Elijah didn't. "All rise," the bailiff called, and everyone in the room stood as Judge Hughes entered. The old man's stern gaze swept over the court as he took his seat. His tone, as always, was clipped and detached. "Be seated." Elijah focused his breathing, his resolve sharpening. He wouldn't let them see him falter. The hearing began with Henry Thompson's lawyer, Samuel Cole, rising to speak. A small, wiry man with sharp features and a reputation for cunning tactics. Cole moved to the podium with an air of confidence. "Your Honor, we are here today to request the immediate dismissal of Mr. Monroe's claim on this property." He paused for dramatic effect, glancing toward Elijah as if daring him to object. "We have evidence, clear and irrefutable, that the Thompsons' family ownership predates any so-called historical ties claimed by Mr. Monroe." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "Evidence? What evidence?" There was no legal document in existence that could justify Thompson's actions. He knew that as well as anyone. Judge Hughes looked down at Cole, adjusting his glasses. "Proceed." Cole motioned to an assistant seated in the front row, who rose and handed the judge a thick, bound folder. Elijah watched carefully as Hughes flipped it open, his expression giving nothing away. "Your Honor," Cole continued, "you'll see a title transfer dated back to 1908, a deed that clearly establishes the Thompsons as legal owners of this land. We believe this document eliminates any ambiguity in this matter." Elijah felt his pulse quicken. He had spent months digging through archives, tracking every deed and record tied to his family's property. There had never been a transfer to the Thompsons, never. His father and grandfather had fought to protect that land, and the Thompsons had never been able to produce proof. Until now. "Objection, Your Honor," Elijah said, rising to his feet. "This document is new to me. I request an opportunity to review it and cross-examine its validity." Judge Hughes looked up at Elijah, his face hard. "You'll get your chance, Mr. Monroe. Sit down." Elijah's fists clenched at his sides, but he sat, his mind already spinning. Where did this document come from? Fabricating evidence was a criminal offense, but the Thompsons had power, connections that stretched far beyond Briar Ridge. If they were willing to falsify documents to win, what else were they hiding? After a brief recess, Elijah paced in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear. Miss Campbell's voice crackled on the other end, frantic and indignant. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "A deed from 1908. Elijah, I've combed through every record. That document didn't exist." "I know," Elijah said, his voice low but steady. "But now it does." Miss Campbell paused. "Do you think they bribed someone? Paid off a clerk to falsify it?" "Wouldn't be the first time a Thompson bought their way out of trouble," Elijah replied bitterly. He stopped pacing, looking out the window to the courthouse lawn below. Protesters had begun to gather, some holding signs that read "Justice" for Monroe. It wasn't many people, yet, but it was enough to make a statement. Enough to let him know he wasn't alone. "What do you want to do?" Miss Campbell asked. Elijah exhaled slowly. "I need proof that the document's fake. Go back to the Land Records Office, check everything from 1900 to 1910. Any inconsistency, any missing pages, find it." "I'm on it." As he ended the call, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Monroe." Elijah turned to see Sheriff Eric Dalton approaching, his expression grave. "Sheriff," Elijah said, trying to mask his frustration. "What can I do for you? I heard about what's happening in there." Dalton glanced toward the courtroom doors. "And look, I just came to tell you to be careful. This isn't a fight you're going to win clean." Elijah bristled at the implication. "And what's that supposed to mean?" Dalton shifted uncomfortably, lowering his voice. "The Thompsons don't play fair. They never have. I don't want to see you caught in something you can't walk away from." Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. "That's the problem, Sheriff. People have been walking away from men like the Thompsons for generations. I'm not going to do the same." Dalton studied him for a moment, his mouth tightening. "Suit yourself," he said quietly before turning to leave. Elijah watched him go, his resolve hardening. It wasn't just about his family anymore. It was about everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, and pushed to the margins. The Thompsons' corruption was a stain that had to be scrubbed clean, and Elijah would see it done, no matter what it took. Back in the courtroom, Judge Hughes returned to the bench, and the hearing resumed. "Mr. Monroe," Hughes said, peering down at him, "do you have any rebuttal to the evidence presented?" Elijah stood, facing the judge and the smug grins of Henry Thompson and Samuel Cole. "Your Honor," Elijah began, his voice clear and measured, "this document raises more questions than it answers. Its sudden appearance is highly suspect, and I intend to prove it is fraudulent." Cole snorted derisively. "Your Honor, we object to Mr. Monroe's baseless accusations." "It's not baseless," Elijah shot back, his composure cracking just slightly. "I've spent months combing through these records. There's no trace of this transfer anywhere, not in deeds, tax records, or historical documents." Judge Hughes held up a hand to silence them both. "Enough!" He turned his gaze to Elijah. "Mr. Monroe, you have until Friday to produce evidence that refutes the document's authenticity. If you cannot, I will rule in favor of the Thompsons. Elijah's breath caught. Friday. Just 3 days. Understood, he said, his voice calm even as tension coiled in his chest. The gavel banged, and court was adjourned. Outside, the crowd had grown larger. Reporters had gathered, holding microphones and cameras, ready to pounce on the outcome of the day's hearing. As Elijah emerged, a flurry of voices hit him all at once. Mr. Monroe, what happened in court today? Is it true the Thompsons produced new evidence? Do you believe this is a cover-up? Elijah raised his hand for silence. The crowd quieted, all eyes on him. This fight isn't over, he said, his voice firm and steady. My family has been tied to this land for over a century. The Thompsons may think they can erase that history, but I won't let them. The crowd murmured in support, and Elijah stepped away, his mind already racing. 3 days. He had 3 days to prove the Thompsons' lies. As he walked toward his car, his phone buzzed. It was Miss Campbell. Elijah, she said breathlessly. You're not going to believe what I just found. Elijah sat in the courthouse's small, dimly lit conference room, the hum of the fluorescent light overhead mixing with the muffled noise of the protesters outside. Spread before him was the evidence that could change everything. Miss Campbell's voice still echoed in his mind from their late-night conversation. You were right, Elijah, she'd said over the phone, almost breathless. The 1908 deed is fake. I found the original record. It had been tampered with. The signature doesn't match, and the notary listed wasn't even registered until 1912. It was the crack in the foundation Elijah needed. The Thompsons' deceitful empire was built on lies, and now he had the sledgehammer to bring it down. The morning of the final hearing came quickly. Elijah entered the courthouse with deliberate steps, head high despite the glares that followed him. Outside, the crowd had doubled in size. Activists, community members, and reporters all waiting for the outcome. Signs reading justice for the Monroes swayed among the sea of faces. Stay focused, Elijah whispered to himself as he passed through the heavy wooden doors of Judge Hughes' courtroom. Henry Thompson was already seated at the defense table, a smug, predatory smile twisting his face. Samuel Cole, his attorney, leaned close, whispering something that made Thompson chuckle darkly. Elijah ignored them, placing his evidence binder on the plaintiff's table with an audible thud. You're late, Cole sneered, his voice low enough for only Elijah to hear. Nervous? Elijah met his eyes coolly. No, just prepared. Judge Hughes entered, and the bailiff's sharp call for order silenced the room. Mr. Monroe, Hughes said, peering over his glasses, you requested this hearing to challenge the evidence presented by the defense. Present your findings. Elijah stood, his calm, commanding voice filling the space. Your Honor, the defense's 1908 deed is fraudulent, and I can prove it. Murmurs swept through the courtroom. Cole shot to his feet. Objection. Baseless accusation. Judge Hughes silenced him with a glare. Sit down, Mr. Cole. Mr. Monroe, proceed. Elijah stepped forward, holding up the Thompsons' evidence. This is the deed the defense submitted, claiming it proves their ownership of the Monroe land. But, Your Honor, my investigation uncovered the original record from 1908, which had been altered. The notary listed on this deed didn't exist until 4 years later. And the signature? He paused for effect. It doesn't match. The crowd in the gallery stirred. A collective gasp broke out as Elijah produced copies of the original record and a detailed comparison of the two signatures. Judge Hughes leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he examined the documents. You're saying this document was falsified, Mr. Monroe? Yes, Your Honor. The Thompsons couldn't prove ownership because they never owned the land. They fabricated the evidence to steal it. Cole sprang to his feet again, his face flushed. This is absurd. Mr. Monroe is grasping at straws. Is that so, Mr. Cole? Elijah interrupted, his voice sharp. Then explain why the notary didn't exist. Explain why the handwriting doesn't match. Explain why you only produced this document days ago when it supposedly existed for over a century. Cole's mouth opened, but no words came out. Henry Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his confident demeanor finally cracking. He leaned toward Cole, whispering furiously. Elijah saw it for what it was, panic. Judge Hughes banged his gavel. Quiet in the courtroom. The next hour became a battle of wills. Samuel Cole threw everything he had at Elijah. Accusations, challenges, and misdirection. But Elijah anticipated every move, countering each argument with evidence Miss Campbell had painstakingly uncovered. He cited record numbers, historical discrepancies, and sworn affidavits from archivists. Bit by bit, the Thompsons' lies unraveled like fraying rope. Finally, Judge Hughes turned to Henry Thompson himself. "Mr. Thompson, do you have any explanation for this?" Henry stood slowly, his expression hardened into a mask of forced composure. "This is nonsense," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I don't know what Monroe did to dig this up, but my family has owned that land for generations. I won't sit here and let a man like him—" "A man like me?" Elijah said sharply, cutting him off. "Say it, Thompson. Say what you mean." The courtroom went deathly silent. Henry's face twisted with barely contained rage, his mask finally slipping. "Your kind doesn't belong there. You never did. That land was always meant to be ours." Elijah felt the words like a slap, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he let them hang in the air, letting Henry's hatred speak for itself. The crowd murmured in shock. Even Judge Hughes looked taken aback. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Thompson," Elijah said calmly. "I think that's all the court needs to hear." Henry realized his mistake too late, his face paling as he sank back into his chair. Judge Hughes rubbed his temple, the weight of the moment evident in his posture. He looked to Elijah, then to Cole, before addressing the courtroom. "This court will recess for 30 minutes, he announced, rising from his seat. "I will return with my decision." The gavel struck, and the room erupted in whispers. Outside the courtroom, Elijah stepped into the hallway to a wave of applause and cheers from his supporters. Miss Campbell rushed over, clutching a folder to her chest, her eyes shining. "You did it, Elijah," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You exposed him." Elijah nodded, though his shoulders remained tense. "It's not over yet." He glanced back toward the courtroom doors, where Henry Thompson stood in the shadows, glaring at him with undisguised hatred. Thompson's lips moved silently, and though Elijah couldn't hear the words, he knew the promise in them. This isn't over. The 30-minute recess stretched into an hour. By the time Judge Hughes returned, the air was heavy with anticipation. "All rise," the bailiff called once more. Judge Hughes settled into his seat, his expression stern. "This has been a complicated and emotional case," he began. "Both sides have presented their arguments. However, the evidence speaks for itself." Elijah held his breath. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Elijah Monroe." The room exploded. Supporters cheered, activists wept, and reporters scrambled for their headlines. Elijah exhaled, his heart thundering in his chest. He'd won. After months of fighting, he'd reclaimed his family's legacy. Henry Thompson slammed his fist onto the table, his face red with fury. "This is a travesty," he shouted. Judge Hughes banged his gavel sharply. "Sit down, Mr. Thompson. You're done here." As Elijah walked out of the courthouse, he was met with thunderous applause. The crowd outside had swelled, their chants of justice for Monroe reverberating through the streets. He paused on the courthouse steps, looking out at the faces, young and old, black and white, all united by a shared belief in justice. A reporter pushed forward, microphone in hand. "Mr. Monroe, what does this victory mean to you?" Elijah met her gaze, his voice strong and clear. "This isn't just my victory. This is a victory for truth, for justice, and for everyone who has been silenced. The Thompsons thought they could bury our history, but history doesn't die. It fights back." The crowd erupted once more, and Elijah turned to descend the steps, shaking hands and embracing his supporters. As he moved through the sea of people, Elijah allowed himself a moment to breathe. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but today they had won a battle that mattered. And as long as he had breath, Elijah would keep fighting. The courthouse lobby buzzed with uneasy silence as Elijah Monroe strode through the double doors, his presence commanding despite the tension crackling in the air. Word had spread. This hearing wasn't just about Elijah's land. It had become a symbol for a deeper struggle in the town, one that had been ignored for too long. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse windows, their muffled chants of justice for Monroe carried in waves by the wind. Elijah paused at the defense table where Henry Thompson, flanked by his lawyer Samuel Cole, watched him like a predator sizing up prey. Thompson's smug expression remained, but there was something else beneath it, an undercurrent of frustration, maybe even fear. "Mr. Monroe," Cole greeted coolly. "Back for another performance?" Elijah ignored him. Instead, his eyes locked on Henry Thompson. "This isn't a performance, Thompson. This is about truth." Henry's lip curled. "Your kind always needs something to cry about. A little bit of land, a little bit of history. You think it makes you better than us now. That you matter." Elijah didn't react. He learned that men like Henry Thompson thrived on anger. He wouldn't give him the satisfaction, the moment of reckoning. The final hearing reconvened under Judge Hughes' steely gaze. The gallery was packed, the tension palpable. Families, reporters, and community leaders filled the rows, waiting to witness the showdown. Henry sat at the defense table, his lawyer standing rigid at his side. Elijah sat opposite them, calm but resolute. As the proceedings began, Cole launched into his argument, a tired recitation of technical jargon that Elijah knew was meant to confuse, to muddy the waters. But today, Elijah had no intention of letting them win through obfuscation. When Cole finished, Elijah stood. "Your Honor, I request a question, Mr. Thompson, directly under oath." A collective murmur swept through the room. Thompson's lawyer bristled. "Objection. Mr. Monroe has no grounds to question my client directly." Judge Hughes turned his sharp gaze to Cole. "Mr. Monroe has presented credible claims of fraud. I'll allow it." Elijah stepped forward, his voice clear and even. "Mr. Thompson, you've testified under oath that your family has owned this land for generations, correct?" Henry leaned back, attempting to feign confidence. "Yes, that's right. And you presented a deed dated 1908 to prove your claim." "Yes." Elijah nodded, holding up a document. "Is this the deed you submitted as evidence?" Henry's gaze flickered, his jaw tightening. "Yes, that's the deed. Are you absolutely certain?" Elijah pressed. Cole shifted in his seat. "Objection, Your Honor," badgering the witness. "Sustained," Judge Hughes warned. "Move it along, Mr. Monroe." Elijah adjusted his tone. "Mr. Thompson, are you aware that this deed contains a signature from a notary who wasn't registered until 1912? Silence. Henry blinked. His lawyer stiffened. "I asked you a question, Mr. Thompson," Elijah said, his voice ringing with authority. "How does a notary sign a document 4 years before they're certified to practice?" Cole jumped to his feet. "Objection. This is a trap." "Overruled," Hughes said, his tone sharp. "Answer the question, Mr. Thompson." Henry's face was flushed, his carefully rehearsed facade beginning to crack. I don't know what you're talking about. That deed is real." Elijah didn't stop. "Do you deny, then, that your family altered this record to take land that never belonged to you in the first place? That you falsified ownership to force my great-grandparents off their rightful property? That's ridiculous." Henry snapped, sweat beading on his forehead. "We've always owned it, always." Elijah took a step closer, his voice measured but unrelenting. "And what if I told you I found letters from 1910? Letters between your grandfather and the then town council, admitting he'd pressured clerks into falsifying records. I have copies." Henry froze, his mask of superiority slipping away completely. The gallery erupted into gasps and murmurs. Judge Hughes banged the gavel. "Order! Order!" Samuel Cole leaned toward Henry, hissing urgently, saying nothing. "Don't answer him." But Henry Thompson couldn't contain himself. His anger boiled over, years of entitlement bursting out in ugly rage. "Those people didn't deserve it," he shouted. "Your family were sharecroppers. They were nothing. That land was ours for the taking." The room fell into stunned silence. For a long moment, no one moved, No one breathed. Henry's words hung like a foul stench. Elijah let the silence linger, his steady gaze meeting Henry's hateful glare. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Thompson. I think the court has heard enough." The true face of the conflict. Judge Hughes' voice broke through the stillness. "This court will recess for deliberation." Henry Thompson slumped in his chair, his lawyer pale beside him. Reporters in the gallery scribbled furiously, while the crowd murmured in hushed tones. Elijah turned and walked back to his seat, his steps deliberate. He felt no satisfaction, not yet. There was too much at stake. He glanced toward the back of the courtroom where his mother and Pastor Thompson sat side by side. His mother's eyes shimmered with tears, but her back was straight, her chin held high. She'd lived long enough to see justice finally stand a chance. Outside the courtroom, the courthouse steps were chaos. Reporters shouted questions, activists waved banners, and camera crews shoved forward to catch a glimpse of Elijah as he emerged. "Elijah Monroe," a reporter called, shoving a mic toward his face. "How do you feel after exposing Henry Thompson in court?" Elijah met the reporter's gaze, his voice steady but unyielding. "This isn't just about me. It's about truth. The Thompsons built their empire on stolen land, and today we expose that truth. Now, the question is, what will this town do with it?" A cheer erupted from the crowd. Elijah's words had struck the chord they needed. But in the corner of his eye, he spotted Henry Thompson watching from the doorway, his face a mask of fury. Their eyes locked for a brief moment, and Elijah saw the truth. Henry wasn't finished. He was beaten, but he wasn't done fighting. The unresolved moment. That night, Elijah sat at his kitchen table, the courthouse papers spread out before him like a battlefield map. The weight of what he'd uncovered, and what it might cost, pressed on him. Exposing Henry Thompson was just the beginning. The Thompsons had friends in high places, and Elijah knew the fight wasn't over. A knock at the door startled him. Elijah rose and opened it to find Miss Campbell, holding a manila folder. Her face was grave. "Elijah, we have a problem." "What is it?" She stepped inside, setting the folder on the table. "I dug deeper after today's hearing. Henry's allies are already moving. They've been reaching out to city officials, trying to bury the case. They'll stop at nothing to keep this quiet." Elijah exhaled, the weight of her words sinking in. "Then we can't stop either." Miss Campbell nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. "What's the plan?" Elijah looked back at the evidence sprawled across his table. Outside his window, the faint glow of streetlights illuminated a town still holding its breath. He didn't want to battle today, but the war was far from over. "We take this beyond the courthouse," Elijah said, his voice steady. "We take it to the people." Miss Campbell nodded. "I'm with you." Elijah sat back down, his gaze fixed on the manila folder. He knew what was coming, a storm far bigger than today's hearing. But he also knew what he was fighting for. "Let them come," he whispered. "I'll be ready." It had been a week since the courtroom showdown, but the ripple effects of Elijah Monroe's revelations were still shaking the town of Greystone. The truth couldn't be buried this time. Newspapers ran headlines exposing Henry Thompson and his family's decades-old fraud. Stolen land exposed. Thompson legacy built on lies. Every morning, Elijah woke to phone calls, emails, and news crews parked outside his modest home. His story had gone nation. He hadn't asked for fame, but it found him anyway. His fight was now the town's fight, the state's fight, perhaps even the nation's fight for accountability. Henry Thompson falls. Henry Thompson's downfall came swiftly. The forged deeds were undeniable. The letters Elijah uncovered irrefutable. Henry's family connections, once untouchable, began to crumble as his allies distanced themselves, eager to save their own reputations. City officials who had turned a blind eye were now scrambling to avoid legal consequences. The town council announced an emergency audit of historical land ownership records. But Henry himself wasn't done lashing out. On the morning of the council's vote to nullify his family's fraudulent claim to the Monroe land, Henry stormed the courthouse steps, cameras trained on him as he shouted, "This is a witch hunt. The Monroe family's lies have poisoned this town." No one believed him. His voice was drowned by protesters waving signs that read "Justice for Monroe" and "Truth can't be stolen." Reporters swarmed him with questions he refused to answer. That night, the council ruled unanimously to restore the Monroe land to Elijah's family. It was over for Henry. A quiet victory. The day Elijah finally stood on the land that once belonged to his great-grandparents was a cool, clear morning. The field stretched out before him, golden under the late afternoon sun. Pastor Thompson and Miss Campbell joined him, their presence quiet and reverent. "This is more than just land, Elijah," Pastor Thompson said softly. "This is legacy." Elijah nodded, his gaze sweeping the field. "It's ours again. For the first time in over a century, it's ours." His mother arrived shortly after, stepping out of her car and taking slow, deliberate steps onto the grass. She wore a smile as tears streamed down her cheeks. "I didn't think I'd live to see this day," she whispered, clutching Elijah's hand. Elijah placed his arm around her shoulder, his voice steady. "We're home now, Mama." Systemic change. Elijah's victory didn't stop at reclaiming the land. The fallout from the case forced Greystone to confront its own deeply rooted issues. Other families came forward with similar stories of stolen property and injustices swept under the rug. The city council, under immense public pressure, established a commission to investigate historical fraud, promising reparations where appropriate. Activists and community leaders from surrounding towns joined forces with Elijah, using his case as momentum to push for change. Elijah became a leader, not just in Greystone but beyond. His quiet strength and perseverance made him a symbol of resilience. Universities invited him to speak on systemic injustice, while law firms reached out to collaborate on similar cases. "We're not just reclaiming land," Elijah said during one speech. "We're reclaiming history. We're reclaiming dignity." Elijah's growth. Despite the overwhelming media attention, Elijah remained the same man. He continued to drive his old truck. He still visited the diner for breakfast, where the waitress, Marcy, now greeted him with a knowing smile and a free cup of coffee. "You're famous now, Mr. Monroe," she teased one morning, setting down his scrambled eggs. "Not famous," Elijah replied with a chuckle. "Just determined." But fame had brought its burdens. He'd received hate mail and veiled threats from those who couldn't stomach his success. Friends warned him to be careful. Henry Thompson's allies hadn't all disappeared. One night, as Elijah sat on his porch watching the sun set, Miss Campbell joined him. She handed him a small folder. "There's something else you should see," she said. Inside were documents showing collusion between Henry Thompson's family and other influential figures, a web of corruption that stretched far beyond Greystone. "This fight isn't over," Elijah murmured, staring at the pages. Miss Campbell smiled faintly. "No, it's not. But you've shown us how to fight it." Elijah sat back, feeling the weight of it all. But he wasn't afraid. He was ready. The town begins to heal. Greystone was changing. The protests that once filled the courthouse lawn had turned into community gatherings. Conversations about justice, equity, and truth were happening everywhere. In churches, schools, and town hall meetings. For the first time, people who'd been silenced felt heard. Lieutenant Karen Mitchell, the town's newly appointed chief of police, approached Elijah one afternoon outside the courthouse. "You're the reason this town's moving forward," she said, extending her hand. Elijah shook it firmly. "We're moving forward together. A new beginning." Months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Elijah stood before a crowd at the community center. Families and neighbors filled the space, cheering as he took the podium. "Today," Elijah began, "we're opening the Greystone Center for Justice and Legacy. This will be a place where families can seek help, legal, financial, and emotional. A place where we tell the truth about our history, no matter how hard it is to hear. A place where no one feels powerless again." The crowd erupted in applause, and Elijah stepped back, humbled by the faces before him. Faces filled with hope. As the event wrapped up, Elijah spotted Henry Thompson lingering at the edge of the crowd, his once imposing figure diminished. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither said anything. Then Henry turned and walked away. Elijah watched him go, feeling no anger, only pity. Unfinished work. That evening, Elijah returned to the field his family had fought so hard to reclaim. The sky was ablaze with hues of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. He stood in the middle of the land, breathing deeply, letting the moment settle into his bones. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from Miss Campbell. New leads. More families coming forward. Let's talk tomorrow. Elijah smiled faintly, sliding the phone back into his pocket. The fight wasn't over, but it didn't feel daunting anymore. He knelt down, letting his fingers graze the cool earth. We're still here, he whispered, and we're not going anywhere. In that quiet moment, surrounded by land that had witnessed so much pain and now, finally, justice, Elijah felt the weight lift off his shoulders. It was far from perfect, but it was progress. The town of Greystone had changed, though change had come painfully slow and at a cost. The battle for the Monroe family land had revealed more than anyone anticipated. Deep cracks in a system that had been built to favor the powerful while silencing others. Elijah Monroe had fought not just for himself or his family, but for something far bigger: truth, dignity, and justice. Elijah's transformation. In the weeks following the courtroom victory and Henry Thompson's downfall, Elijah had time to reflect on his journey. He wasn't the same man who had quietly walked into the town clerk's office that first day, holding his family's dusty records and hoping for fairness. Back then, Elijah believed truth alone would be enough to set things right. He had carried himself with quiet humility, trusting the same system that had failed his ancestors. But as the events unfolded, first the dismissal, then the threats, the betrayals, and the injustices, he had realized something profound. Justice wasn't a passive thing. It required persistence, sacrifice, and a refusal to back down when the world pushed back. He had learned that truth was only powerful if wielded with courage. Now, standing on the reclaimed land, his land, Elijah felt a profound sense of pride, not just for himself, but for the generations before him who had been denied this moment. He had honored their sacrifices by refusing to let history erase them. This was their victory as much as it was his. The ripple effect of justice. Elijah's case did more than expose Henry Thompson's fraud. It shattered a wall of silence that had surrounded Greystone for decades. Families who had resigned themselves to injustices long forgotten began to step forward. Each voice that emerged carried its own story of stolen opportunities, buried truths, and silent suffering. The town council, under immense scrutiny, launched an independent investigation into historical property records. What they uncovered would later make headlines: patterns of systemic fraud that stretched back generations. Other prominent families, once seen as untouchable, faced legal and public reckonings. In the face of these revelations, Greystone's community found itself at a crossroads. It could no longer pretend that its past sins were isolated incidents. Conversations once avoided now filled the town square, schools, and churches. Topics of race, legacy, and fairness weren't whispered about anymore. They were being debated openly, and for the first time, people were listening. This wasn't just Elijah's victory. It was a turning point for a town that had been trapped in its own denial. A broader reflection on justice. Elijah's struggle reflected something larger, a truth that resonated far beyond Greystone. In towns and cities across the country, communities faced their own reckonings, uncovering injustices hidden beneath years of complacency. Elijah understood this now. His fight wasn't unique. Families like his had been fighting for centuries, often without the recognition or justice they deserved. Racism, inequality, and abuse of power were not problems limited to small towns. They were systemic issues embedded into the fabric of society. Yet Elijah's story was proof that change was possible. One person could make a difference, but true progress required a collective effort. During one of his speeches at a civil rights summit, Elijah shared a simple, powerful message. Justice doesn't come because we ask for it. It comes when we demand it, when we refuse to stay silent, no matter how insurmountable the odds seem. Real change begins when we believe that our voices matter and that we deserve to be heard. His words resonated deeply. Hope in action. Elijah remained determined not to let his victory become the end of the story. The Greystone Center for Justice and Legacy, which he had helped establish, became a beacon for families seeking truth and fairness. The center didn't just provide legal aid. It became a hub for education, workshops, and community empowerment. Miss Campbell, Pastor Thompson, and other leaders worked side by side with Elijah, ensuring that those who felt powerless could find their strength. They offered young people lessons on civic participation, history, and advocacy, helping them understand their rights and the power of their voices. For Elijah, seeing the center thrive was more rewarding than any courtroom victory. One day, as he stood outside the center watching families filter in and out, Pastor Thompson approached him with a smile. "You know, you've become quite the hero in this town," the pastor said, clapping him on the back. Elijah shook his head, smiling faintly. "I'm no hero, Pastor. I'm just a man who refused to give up." Pastor Thompson chuckled. "That's what makes you a hero, Elijah. You didn't just fight for yourself. You showed the rest of us how to stand up and fight too." Elijah paused, letting the pastor's words sink in. He wasn't comfortable with the praise, but he understood what it meant. By taking a stand, he had shown others that justice, no matter how elusive, was worth pursuing. A future of possibilities. Months later, as Elijah watched the sunset over his family's land, he reflected on the road ahead. The journey wasn't over. There would still be setbacks, battles to fight, and minds to change. But he wasn't discouraged. Change wasn't about quick fixes or perfect solutions. It was about persistence, one conversation, one action, one small victory at a time. He thought of his mother's smile the day they reclaimed the land, of Miss Campbell's unwavering support, of the young people who now carried hope in their hearts instead of resentment. Elijah understood that this was how legacies were built, not in grand gestures, but in moments of courage and unity. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah whispered a quiet promise to himself and to the generations before him. "We're still here, and we'll keep fighting." A call to action. Elijah Monroe's story was not just his own. It was a reminder to all of us. It was a call to recognize the injustices woven into the foundations of our systems and to confront them, even when it's uncomfortable. It was a call to honor those who came before us and ensure that their struggles were not in vain. Most importantly, it was a call to believe in progress, to trust that while change is hard, it is always possible when we work together with purpose and determination. Because justice, as Elijah proved, isn't simply given. It's earned, and it's worth fighting for. As the final scenes of Elijah Monroe's story come to a close, one truth remains. The fight for justice is never over, but neither is hope. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Stand up for those whose voices need to be heard. Because together, we can create a better world, one step at a time.